Barnabas and Saul return from Jerusalem to bringing with them a new partner. They bring with them John Mark, who is a relative of Barnabas's and probably also of Peter's. They come back to go to Antioch, and there the leadership of the church, charged with a new excitement about what happened in Jerusalem, began to see that Paul and Barnabas should go out into the Gentile world and bring the gospel with them. And so they sense a call for Barnabas and Saul, and they send them out on their first missionary journey. Now, for us in the modern day, it's easy for us to think about missions in the context of the last 2,000 years of Christian missions. But in Saul's day, missions didn't really exist. No one would go from their land to a foreign land with the express purpose of sharing their faith with a new set of people. And so really, when Barnabas and Saul are called by the leaders of Antioch to go out and commissioned by them to go out on their behalf to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to the Greek world, they're breaking new ground. So when they leave, they go first to the island of Cyprus, right off the coast of Palestine. And it's an easy place because we know that, or we think that Barnabas and John Mark had relatives there. So they start in the west end of the island, or east end of the island, and they work their way through to the west side of the island. When they get to the west side, they visit the place where the proconsul is. And they were actually invited by the proconsul to come and to share this new message with him. They, in each city, started in the synagogue, and then they would go out into the marketplaces. And as they went into the proconsul's place, they were encountered by a magician named Bar-Jesus, who was serving the proconsul. And they got into a conflict with Bar-Jesus, and Paul rebukes Bar-Jesus in front of the proconsul, and Bar-Jesus is stricken blind. So this powerful display of Paul's ministry immediately convinces the proconsul that his ministry and his words is truth, and they began to believe the words that Paul was saying about this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And so what a great sign here that Paul finally is coming into his own, and that his call that he received so long ago on the road to Damascus is beginning to show some fruit and show what God had promised him those many years ago. And at this point, we began to see Luke's account about Paul change in his name being called Saul to Paul, and also Paul's name always is referred to before Barnabas's after this. So Barnabas and Paul and Barnabas take off, they go to the mainland. John Mark doesn't go with them. We don't really know why that John Mark chooses to not continue on the mission with them, but it's possible that when he saw the conflicts that were arising through Cyprus, that he knew it would be even more dangerous as they entered into the lands in the main pagan world. And he was afraid, and he knew that he was safe on Cyprus, and so he chickened out in a sense and didn't go with them to the mainland. So Paul and Barnabas go on their own to the mainland, and they visit 4 major cities. They visit another city named Antioch, Pisidian Antioch. They visit Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. And in each one of these cities, they experience various success and persecution. Now, most of the time when they experience success, it's within the small groups of Jews and Gentiles that they preach the good news about Jesus to, and people believe. But there's always people who react poorly to the message and began to try and shun Paul and Barnabas. In Antioch, they're driven out of the city. In Iconium, there's a plot to kill Paul, and so those who had believed found out about it, and they snuck Paul out at night. And then Paul goes to Lystra, and he's actually stoned by the people of Lystra and left for dead outside of the city walls. But somehow he survives, and he gets up and he goes with Barnabas into the next city, Derbe. And there they gain many believers, many different people. On their way back, they retrace their steps and they visit all the cities where people had begun to believe in the good news of Jesus, and they begin to strengthen them and train new leadership for these fledgling communities that were rising up around this man, Jesus Christ. And they eventually get to the coast and they take off and they go back home. Now, why was Paul's message so both successful and threatening to the Jews in the pagan world? Well, first thing is that the way that the Jews saw the pagan world was that the reason why there was so much sin and darkness, it was because of the worship of the pagan gods. If the pagan world would stop worshiping the pagan gods and submitting themselves to these false gods, then they would be free from sin and death and the effects of sin and death. And so Jesus, the message of Jesus, gives them an opportunity and a freedom to break away from the imprisonment of the worship of the false gods and to begin to worship the one true God. At the same time, the Jews receive good news because Jesus is the Messiah of the God that they worship. Proof that the promise that God had given them for centuries, for millennia, was finally here. But also this was a threat because the people of the Greek world did not want to relinquish their worship and their sense of power and control over the people to this new religion, this new idea. And then Jews, who looked at this message as not being true, were very, very hesitant to accept what Paul was teaching. For the Jew, it's got to be fair here, to react in a way against this message with some hesitancy and with fear and trepidation is not necessarily an unnatural thing. Even Paul himself reacted this way. Remember back when he was a persecutor? And so as Paul is preaching this news to them, they're thinking of the Jews being not separated from the pagan world around them, the purity that they were keeping. Because in the Old Testament, every time they began to intermingle with the cultures around them, that's when things began to go wrong and they began to do things that God wasn't happy with. And then they were punished in some way or another. And so they wanted to keep that separation permanent so that they can keep their purity. So as Paul was preaching a message of inclusion and bringing the Gentile world into the Jewish world, there was a threat against that purity, that specialness that they had given to themselves over all those years. And that was a real threat to them. So it's no wonder that they would react with such zeal to stop the message of Jesus Christ spreading among their people, because there is a threat that they might lose that purity. And we'll see in the next video how that plays with Paul's ministry.